Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lithuania. There was a good reason for the conference we are about to begin. 100 years ago, the territory of Memel or Klaipėda became part of Lithuania. In this country, especially before the Second World War, and perhaps to a less extent now, this was considered one of the most significant events in national history. In terms of significance, it was compared to the Declaration of Lithuanian Independence in February 1918, because the annexation of Memel meant that Lithuania gained a port, the opportunity to diversify its foreign trade partners, and to break free from economic dependence on Germany. Moreover, the annexation of Klaipėda became a mobilizing moment of pride and belief in one's own national potential for an emerging nation-state that only recently had to cope with the loss of its capital, Vilnius. In 1923, however, Klaipėda became part of Lithuania as a result of a card game that was not played openly. Of course, this was not the first political change that did not coincide with the new geopolitical order created by the principal Allied powers. At the end of 1919, Gabriele D'Annunzio tried to influence the international status of the former Hungarian port of Fiume. In late 1920, this led to the expulsion of D'Annunzio and the proclamation of the Free State of Fiume, which was, however, divided between Italy and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes 4 years later. In 1920 and 1921, uprisings led by Wojciech Korfanty and others attempted to influence the political destiny of Upper Silesia. This led to Allied intervention and the partition of the region, with most industrial areas annexed to Poland. And of course, in October 1920, Poland staged a mutiny of its troops led by General Lucjan Żeligowski in Vilnius. The result was the self-proclaimed state of Central Lithuania, which ceased to exist in 1922 when it was annexed by Poland. Although the Allies had not yet recognized this change, Vilnius was de facto part of Poland in late 1922. So the right-wing circles and the military in Lithuania were undoubtedly stimulated, so to say, by all this, and especially by the consequences, or rather the lack thereof, of Żeligowski's action in Vilnius. Many other examples may also have had an influence, such as Benito Mussolini's successful march on Rome in the end of October 1922. Of course, what happened in early 1923 did not at first seem like a realistic or appropriate plan to many Lithuanian politicians. For 3 years, since 1919, they had hoped that the Allies would sooner or later hand over the port of Memel to the Lithuanian state. This hope became especially reasonable after Lithuania formally joined the League of Nations in September 1921, but years passed without the Klaipėda question being resolved. Finally, when the Conference of Ambassadors appointed a special commission at the end of 1922, and information leaked out that this commission had no intention at all of making a decision favorable to Lithuania, the Lithuanian government in Kaunas decided to act. What it tried to show the world was a staged insurrection of the local population in the Klaipėda region. Their purpose was to overthrow the government set up by the Allied High Commissioner and present the Allies with a fait accompli, just as Poland had done with the staging of the Żeligowski mutiny in Vilnius. You can see how events develop further on this slide. The so-called insurrection in Klaipėda was not a topic openly discussed in Lithuania before the Second World War, and even after the war, the situation did not change fundamentally. Lithuanian historians have only recently begun to openly present the events of the annexation of Klaipėda to Lithuania. In January 1993, so 30 years ago, the then newly founded Klaipėda University invited American, German, Lithuanian and Polish historians to Klaipėda to talk about this topic. The organizers called the event Klaipėda's reunification with Lithuania, or the Anschluss of Memel, January 1923, and deliberately tried to highlight the two extremes that sometimes still prevailed at that time in the interpretation of these events in Lithuania and Germany, respectively. This conference was actually the real beginning of the academic debate on the subject, and since then historians have indeed done much to shed light on various aspects of the events in Memel in 1923, the role of the Lithuanian government and the local population, the course of the military operation, and the reaction of the principal Allied powers and its consequences. So a few years ago, when we were thinking about what to do next in a new academic conference, we were just looking for the topics that were not yet so developed, so to say, and the focus of this conference was finally decided after discussions with our partners in Vilnius, with the representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, specifically with the ambassador and former historian Vytautas Žalys, and in Klaipėda with a representative of the city administration. Both wanted to have some conferences, so we decided afterwards that it would be better to have one larger conference than two separate, smaller ones, and this explains the double focus of this conference and rather unusual format. The first part of the conference takes place today in Vilnius, while on Saturday, the same conference but with a different focus meets in Klaipėda. This conference has two interrelated aims. First, it focuses on the question of how regions such as the territory of Memel emerged on the political map of Europe after the First World War, and what lasting impact their emergence had on the identity of the inhabitants of these regions. Secondly, it aims at a deeper reflection on the impact of the events in Klaipėda in 1923 and the events that followed on the international situation, because we are sure that the annexation of Klaipėda to Lithuania affected not only the inhabitants of this town or the territory, not only the Republic of Lithuania, but also had both short and long-term consequences for international relations. We started organizing this conference more than a year ago through the joint efforts of three institutions: the Institute of Baltic Region History and Archaeology at Klaipėda University, the Center for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge, and the Lithuanian Institute of History. During this time, we have been assisted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Lithuania and the Martynas Mažvydas National Library of Lithuania, whose hospitality has enabled us to gather in this conference room this morning. Of course, the conference would not have taken place without all the participants who responded to our call for papers, so thank you for coming, and without the contribution of the institutions that have seen fit to financially support such academic discussions. And here we have the support of the Municipality of Klaipėda, the Research Council of Lithuania, and the Ministry of Culture of the Republic of Lithuania. So I thank all the partners, sponsors, and participants for their contributions. And let me conclude this introductory part by expressing the hope that we will all benefit from the contributions of this conference, that they will help us to gain a better insight into the role of the Klaipėda region in international relations in the interwar period, as well as into the history of regions like Klaipėda in the 20th century. Now, after this introduction, we now have some time for a few words of welcome. And as I said earlier, a number of institutions have contributed to this conference. Some of their representatives will speak at the beginning of the second part of the conference in Klaipėda, so there will be two, so to say, welcome addresses, one here and another in Klaipėda. In the meantime, I would like to give the floor here to those we will not see in Klaipėda. And the first on my list is Dr. Aurimas Švedas, who is a Deputy Director of the Lithuanian Institute of History. Aurimas, please tell us something.
Good morning. Dear participants of the conference, great historical events are similar to the seismic waves which travel through the Earth's inner layers and its surface. The great historical events usually initiate fractures and changes which leave a trace in different history layers visible from so-called the longue durée perspective. The annexation of Klaipėda Memel region belongs to the category of such events. A military operation in Klaipėda changed the historical reality which existed 600 years. The peace treaty of Melno between the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Poland and the Teutonic Order established clear borders and defined the status of the Klaipėda Memel region for the long centuries in 1422. Such historical reality was changed in 1923. Lithuanian society got a unique opportunity to start working on its maritime policy for the first time in the existence of the Lithuanian state. Such a statement is not new in Lithuanian historiography. The importance of so-called Klaipėda operation is already marked in Lithuanian historical culture. To celebrate the anniversary of these events, the Seimas of Lithuania has proclaimed 2023 the year of the Klaipėda region. But trying to understand the importance of the particular events and processes, it is not enough to think about their uniqueness. It is crucially important to place such events and processes in the context. The organizers of the conference offered for us to look at the Klaipėda Memel region as the one of the several European borderland micro-regions that shared a similar historical destiny and certain features in 1918-1923. Such an intellectual effort is a new attitude in Lithuanian historiography. It gives us an opportunity to look into the history of Lithuania not as the isolated island or besieged fortress, but as an integral part of European history. As Professor Vasilijus Safronovas mentioned, this conference was organized by the three institutions. I would like to stress that especially important part of work was done by the colleagues from the Institute of Baltic Region History and Archaeology at Klaipėda University. This institute became intellectual hub for the scientists which work for many years on Klaipėda city and Klaipėda Memel region history. On behalf of the director of the Lithuanian Institute of History, Professor Alvydas Nikžentaitis, I would like to welcome all participants of the conference in Vilnius and to wish for productive discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aurimas. That was very kind of you. Before we continue, I would also like to ask Professor Renaldas Gudauskas, who is the Director General of this house and host of the first part of the conference, to say a word of welcome. Professor Gudauskas, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, dear participants, organizers, partners and sponsors of the International Scientific Conference, dear colleagues and associates. I would like to greet the speakers, participants and guests of the topical conference, the 1923 annexation of the Klaipėda region to Lithuania, its significance and long-term impact in the context of the European periphery micro-regions. The National Library continues its mission to be a public platform for the country's most important public forums, topical discussions, and sharp academic debates. It's safe to say that it is here, under the arches of the National Library, that courageous initiatives and noble actions are born, and that issues relevant to the country are discussed. Therefore, we are particularly pleased that the distinguished conference speakers and experienced international experts will be discussing the scientific aspects of this understudied historical topic of the at the National Library, and will be filling a niche in the field of comparative studies of the microregions of Central and Eastern Europe with their scientific insights. We are delighted to be able to help the conference achieve its goals and appreciate not only the good feedback, but also the positive emotions, smiles, and partnerships created. I wish everyone a smooth and fulfilling day of work. Thank you very much.
Our keynote speaker today is Brendan Sims, professor of the history of European international relations at the University of Cambridge. Professor Sims is an expert on European geopolitics, past and present, and his main interests are the German question, Britain and Europe, humanitarian intervention, and state building. Professor Sims, as it says on the Cambridge website, is a frequent contributor to print and broadsheet media. He has advised governments and parliaments and spoken at Westminster in the European Parliament and at think tanks in the United Kingdom, the United States, and many Eurozone countries. And last but not least, Professor Sims is the director of the Center for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge, leading one of the co-organizing institutions of this conference. So, Brendan, we are very pleased to have you here today, and please, the floor is yours. You will find your presentation here.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here, actually to be back in Vilnius after our visit last year. I'd like to thank the hosts and organizers. First of all, of course, Vasilijus Safronovas and the Institute for Baltic Region History and Archaeology at Klaipėda University. I'm particularly pleased to have this collaboration because it deepens our cooperation that we established between the Center for Geopolitics, where we have a Baltics geopolitics program, and Vasilijus and Klaipėda University. I'd also like to thank, secondly, the Lithuanian Institute for History here in Vilnius, Tomas Balkelis and his colleagues. I'd like to thank, thirdly, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Lithuania, for its support, and of course the National Library for hosting us in this really splendid space. So I'm going to now repay your kindness by reading out an insulting extract, which I hope you will not hold against me, because I think it illustrates a point, and it's an extract from a travelogue written by Robert Johnston, a British traveller who travelled around the Baltic Sea region, the entire littoral more or less, in 1815. And he's coming from Eastern Prussia, heading towards what was then called Memel. And I'll read out a couple of extracts. He says, "However agreeable the journey from Tilsit to Memel might appear, yet the instant the latter town is approached, all softness of ideas is overturned, every object of picturesque beauty vanishes, and nothing is beheld but a wretched town, surrounded on the one side by a wilderness of loose sand, and on the other by the sea." Then he goes on to say, Memel is the great depot of timber brought down the Niemen. The harbour is formed by the entrance of the Korsches Haff, which is only a quarter of a mile broad and not more than 13 feet deep. In consequence of this, large vessels take in part of their cargo about a mile out at sea. Around the suburbs are erected a number of windmills, which are used as sawmills to cut up the timber before it is exported. The quantity of timber exported from Memel was calculated at £350,000 sterling per annum, but this has considerably decreased, partly from the effects of the late war, i.e. the Napoleonic Wars, and also, it is said, from the diminution of the forests in Poland. Then he goes on to provide a very orientalizing description of the Lithuanians as he saw them, and I quote, and again forgive me, the Lithuanians are a coarse, clumsy, and stupid class of people. Their ideas, manners, dress, and actions are those of the dullest, heaviest, and most inanimate description. Then he goes on to a long account of how the Lithuanians drink. They pass the bottle back and forth, and then an account of how Lithuanian women do the same. And then he talks about they do all of this with the grimaces of a complete caricature. Now, of course, this account was in itself a complete caricature. But I shared it with you because I think it illustrates two themes. One is the really quite considerable condescension of British observers towards the region and its inhabitants, which I think endured throughout the 19th century then and into the 20th century. And I think we'll hear more about the importance of these attitudes in the approach to issues like the Memel question. And secondly, because it illustrates the economic importance of Memel at the end of the 18th and the early 19th century. I think it'd be true to say that if you asked anybody at that time and before then what was the significance of Memel, they would have emphasized the economic rather than the political and the strategic. I'm open to correction on that, but that's my perception. It was part of the central fact of Baltic geopolitics, which is that the Baltic is not just or even primarily a littoral, but that there's a vast hinterland into which feed the seven great rivers, of which, of course, the Nemunas or the Niemen or the Memel was one. So the key point here is that Memel was a conduit, or French would say conduit, a place through which trade flowed, and in particular the hinterland was connected with Europe and the rest of the world. But strategically, it doesn't seem at this time to have been much mentioned. It's not, for example, talked of in the same way as the Danish Sound, the Belt, even the Åland Islands, which featured quite a lot even in the 19th century. Memel, so far as I'm aware, was not paid the backhanded compliment of being attacked by the Royal Navy or bombed by the Royal Air Force. Many other places in the Baltic Sea region have suffered that fate. Think of Copenhagen, think of Bomersund, think of Sveaborg, think of Kiel, think of Lübeck, Rostock, Königsberg, etc. I think the closest the Navy got was Baltisk Pillar, which is quite close, but not Memel itself. So in that sense, Memel and its environs historically didn't seem, at least from the early modern period, to be that much disputed. It wasn't, at that point, one of the great cockpits of European history. Now, of course, that changes, as we've just heard, and we're going to hear at much greater length in the course of the next couple of days. And it's not my job to talk about that. That's everybody else's job, and I look forward to hearing about that. What I'm going to do instead is to offer some wider geopolitical reflections on the context, more in the way of reminding you of this than of telling you of this, because I think the broad contours will be familiar to you, and then at the end I'll raise some questions which I hope the conference will answer. But before I go on, this is an image of Memel Klaipėda at the beginning of the 19th century, which actually looks much nicer than Robert Johnson allowed, so I think he must have had a bad day. when he was visiting. All right, so let me now, in the remaining 15 minutes, 20 minutes or so, talk a bit about the 5 big interrelated themes, of which I think Memel is part. 5 themes of post-war Europe, and I'll be very brief. I'm just opening them up for you. First, the collapse of empires and the establishment of new states. Secondly, the role of Germany and the Germans after 1918. Thirdly, the relationship of the rest of Europe to the Bolshevik Revolution. Fourthly, the role of the great powers, particularly France and Britain. And fifthly, the testing ground for the machinery of a new international organization, the League of Nations. So let's begin with the collapse of empires. As we all know, 4 empires collapse at the end of the First World War: the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And you can see from the shadings here the establishment of all these new states out of the wreckage of that empire. Poland, of course, the 3 Baltic states. Finland, which you don't see, emerges out of its autonomy into independence. Of course, the creation of the successor states of the Habsburg Empire, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this creates a range of nationality disputes across Europe. Some of them already been mentioned by Vasilijus, but you've got Upper Silesia, which you mentioned. You've got South Tyrol between Italy and Germany/Austria. You have all the Western German disputes around Malmedy, North Schleswig, Alsace-Lorraine, I guess. The Vilnius dispute here has already been mentioned, and we're not even going into all the Balkan and Near Eastern dispute, although I'll come back to that a little bit later on. Now, one of the things that is part of the creation of new states is the question of access to the sea. Because, of course, while you had the big empires, it didn't really matter. Even if you were a landlocked state, say like Hungary, you had access to the sea via Trieste primarily, but also other ports. But after 1918, 1919, you've got several states like Hungary and Czechoslovakia who have absolutely no sea access at all. And then you've got states like Poland, which have very limited access. I mean, they may have a stretch on the sea, but they don't have a proper port. Hence the question of Danzig, which I'll come back to under international organization. And of course, it was mentioned that for Lithuania, access to the rest of the world, the possibility of a maritime destiny and so on, was entirely contingent on having control over Memel. Because although Lithuania is described even today as a Baltic state, without Memel and access to the sea, it would basically just have been an Eastern European state. So in that sense, completely unlike Latvia and Estonia. So Memel, in other words, once again, a vital conduit, passageway to the outside world. But the Memel issue was also part of the wider contestation in northeastern and eastern Europe after the end of the First World War. You had these new national states trying to hold off the Bolshevik challenge and German revanchism in its various forms. In Finland, we had a vicious civil war which killed more than 1% of the population in 6 months. And of course, you had the many-sided conflicts in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. You had the backwash from the Polish-Soviet War of 1920. And the nature of these wars was incredibly brutal. I'll just read out here, admittedly, a retrospective view from Rudolf Höss, German, who was a volunteer in Latvia after 1918, later, of course, became commandant of Auschwitz. And he says, I quote, "The battles in the Baltic states were more brutal and vicious than anything I had experienced before. There was hardly a front line. The enemy was everywhere. Wherever the opposing forces collided, there was slaughter until no one was left. So this whole environment post 1918, 1919 in Europe was incredibly brutal. And although it's often said that the end of the First World War ushered in a post-war, and then later, of course, we spoke of interwar, in fact, that's only true of Western Europe. For much of the rest of the continent, as you know, the next 5 years were essentially the continuation of war. This has been described in really compelling detail by Robert Gervath in his book, The Vanquished. 5 years of bloody conflict, hunger, and displacement. Indeed, 4 million people were actually killed after the war in Europe. So more than the total combat fatalities of British, the French, and the Americans killed in Europe, many of them in Eastern Europe, after the war. So this is the wider framing to what is going on in Memel, Klaipėda. So that's the first point. Secondly, the question of Germany and the Germans after 1918. So if you look at this map, you can see from the different shadings that Germany has been very heavily pruned by the Allies at the Treaty of Versailles, having lost Alsace-Lorraine, North North Schleswig, the Polish corridor in particular. And this was done to reward the victors and to keep Germany weak. But Germany was still very large and paradoxically relatively larger in Europe. So relative to the large empires that we have before 1914, Germany is actually bigger because the Russian Empire has collapsed, the Austro-Hungarian Empire has collapsed, and so on. And so, of course, Germany is trying to get back into the game after 1918, 1919. And this is a big part of the story of Memel, Klaipėda, as the Germans seek to leverage for advantage. So I look forward to hearing more about that in the conference. But that story, which we're going to hear about, is only part of that wider story of Germany's attempt to revise Versailles or to accept other parts of it for tactical reasons. Then we come to the relationship of Europe to the Bolshevik Revolution, which of course has encompassed Russia, but also spread in a sense to Germany and Hungary, has also led to the establishment of revolutionary communist parties, even where these don't seize power, however, briefly. That in turn provoked the backlash, the intervention from the Western side, so British, French, American, and even Japanese in Siberia forces go to do battle with the Bolsheviks. And the British are particularly active in this. So you've got British forces in the Caucasus, in the Black Sea, the High North, in the Baltic, even Central Asia, and French forces as well. So all this is going on at the same time as the Memel issue is unfolding. And there's a basic problem geopolitically in the interrelationship between the German question and the Bolshevik threat. And it's very simply this, which is that if you depress Germany too much, then you will let the Russians in, the Bolsheviks in, and German politicians and those who sympathize with Germany play very much on this factor. But on the other hand, if you raise Germany too much to contain, or raise them back up too much to contain the Soviet Union, then of course Germany would dominate and Europe would be back to where it started in 1914. So this is also in the back of the minds as people address the Memel issue. Fourthly, the question of the great powers in Europe after 1918. We've already talked quite a bit about it. These were primarily Britain and France, because Italy, one of the other victor powers, really has relatively few interests outside the Mediterranean and the Balkans. The United States has largely retreated after 1919, the failure to ratify the League of Nations, a certain sort of buyer's guilt of having fought in the war, intervened in the first place, and returned only as part of the financial stabilization after 1924. And the key power here really is France, which, as Vasilijus mentioned, is then really the military power in Memel from February 1920. And it's worth pausing for a moment to reflect on what France's overall strategy is here. Really what France is doing is it is trying to maintain what it calls a cordon sanitaire, so a cordon linking Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and perhaps also the Baltic states, together as a kind of barrier. And this is very similar, actually, to the 17th, 18th century French strategy of leapfrog diplomacy. So Louis XIV reaching out to Sweden, to the Ottomans, and to the Poles. And at that time, the idea was to keep out the Tsarist Empire and to box in the Habsburgs. Well, the cordon sanitaire after 1919 has a very similar function, which is to keep the Bolsheviks out and to contain Germany. And I think this is the wider context to French policy towards Lithuania and Memel, which, as I say, is part of this wider desire to maintain the cordon sanitaire, particularly Poland, against the German Reich, but also against the Soviet Union. Now, in the background to all of this, there's also the cultural attitudes brought by Western Europeans, especially the British, towards this story. I hinted at the attitudes in the early 19th century, as you saw with Robert Johnson. You actually see these views surviving more or less intact into the early 20th century, and in fact intensifying. So that might have been the view of the Lithuanians, but actually views of Poles in the 19th century in the British side were actually quite positive in certain contexts. But by the early 20th century, these had also declined. So the civilizational assumptions about the state-building capacity of the Eastern Europeans was a part of this mix, geopolitical mix. And I think we'll be hearing more about that as well during the conference. And lastly on that one, I just want to mention the obvious fact that, of course, certainly for Britain, but also for France, to a considerable extent, all of this is taking place in a much larger global context. So the collapse of the empires, of the empires of the Central Powers and the Ottoman Empire have actually increased French and British colonial holdings, but at the same time given them a whole set of new problems they have to deal with. So the French, for example, problems almost immediately in Syria, the British in Iraq, and so on and so forth. So if you look at that map, you can see Memel isn't actually on it, but you can see it is quite a small part of this picture. And even if you just looked at Europe and the Near East, there's so much else specifically that is going on for the British and the French. The huge tussle before 1923 over the future of the former Ottoman lands. So the British in 1920 occupying Constantinople, then the question of whether they defend that space against Ataturk in 1922, the French going into the Rhineland in 1923, and so on and so forth. Then lastly, and very briefly, the question of the testing ground for the machinery of the new League of Nations. So this was part of a general phenomenon which we see even today, which is that very often the major powers, when they have something they don't know how to deal with, they put it in the too difficult box and they hand it over to an international organization. And that's to a certain extent what happens here. But the paradox is that, of course, the League is simultaneously an institution designed to contain Germany, very specifically, but it's also meant to act as a bona fide mediator and problem solver, which is a real tension. We see that at play over Memel. And it had taken on, immediately after Versailles, the case of Danzig, which was mentioned already, which is contested, of course, between Germans and Poles. and it makes it a free city under the protection of the League. There's the establishment of a High Commission. There's a High Commissioner in charge of the city. And that addresses the problem of Poland's access, or for a while anyway, of Poland's access to the sea, although not entirely satisfactorily, because they then feel the need to build an additional port at Gdynia, and so on. And so what the hope is that the same can be done for Memel. You've got obviously similar issues, a contested space, the question of access to the sea. And the German majority, but in a larger space dominated by the other nationality. Although, of course, Memel is even more complicated than Danzig, because it's a three-way struggle rather than a two-way struggle. But the geopolitical dynamics are very similar. So, given this wider turbulent context, I think it's hardly surprising that Memel remained contested between 1919 and 1923, because everything else was contested as well. But then, from 1924, Europe experiences what turns out to be a temporary, but at the time they do not know, to be a temporary stabilization. Germany settles down to a certain extent. The Weimar Republic stabilizes. The Turkish succession is resolved. The Poles and the Soviets disentangle themselves. And even economically, with the Dawes and then later the Young Plan, things seem to be on the right course. And therefore, it's unsurprising that the same happens. Is that the right flag, Vasilijus? Thank you very much. I got the wrong one in my original slides. That in 1924, as we'll hear, you have the Memel Statute, the establishment of an autonomous region guaranteed by the League. So this is part of the overall stabilization of Europe. Memel then makes a brief comeback as a major issue in the 1930s. On Vasilijus's timeline, you could see in March 1939, the area is re-annexed to the German Reich by Adolf Hitler. And superficially, this is part of the great ingathering of German people territories, like the Anschluss, the Sudetenland, the occupation of Bohemia and Moravia that same month. But actually, the main purpose of seizing Lithuania is for it to be part of what was known as the Northern Rollbahn. So essentially, the original conception on Hitler's side was that he would actually ally with Poland, and there would be two Rollbahn, two axes advance into the Soviet Union. Poles refused to collaborate, but in any case, Memel would be part of the Northern Rollbahn. So again, you might say that Memel Klaipėda had reverted to its traditional role of being a conduit, a passageway, although in this case, not so much a passageway from the hinterland to the sea, but actually the other way around, a passageway for troops that will be coming from Germany by sea to go into the Soviet Union, into the hinterland. So I've come to the end of my brief framing remarks. I just want to leave you with a couple of questions, which I'm sure the conference will answer, as well as many other questions, of course. So my first question is, how did a weakened Germany try to exploit Allied divisions to give her options over Memel, and with what success? So how did they succeed in carving out, despite the fact that they were on the floor, some kind of room for maneuver? Secondly, how did the British and French desire to balance the punishment of Germany with the containment of the Soviet Union? How did that affect the Memel story? In particular, because of course there were then two parties that you wanted to try to prop up, Poland and Germany, rather than just one, and you couldn't prop up one without depressing the other. Thirdly, was the League of Nations involvement driven by a genuine desire for international governance, or by the realpolitik ambitions of the Council members, particularly, of course, of France and Britain? And what was the role of the United States, which, of course, then provided the chairman of the Special League Commission? Fourthly, how important were Western cultural assumptions about Poles and Lithuanians to decision-making over Memel? Fifthly, should we pay more attention to the role of France in the post-war Baltic. I'm as guilty as anybody else because we run a Baltic geopolitics program in Cambridge, which is all about exalting the role of Britain, past and present. And so I became conscious as I looked into Memel that actually the role of France was actually very important. And is this a wider story that we should consider? And finally, last question is, what role did global and wider European pressures play in Western decision-making over Memel, as opposed to the assessments of the merits of this specific case? But as I say, that's it from me, but I now look forward to hearing from the real experts. Thank you for your attention.
We still have some time for questions. Do we have questions?
Protests, observations.
Protests from Germany.
No, thank you very much, Brendan Sims, for this exposition of the Memel question within internal policy. I'm using one of your points to shorten my presentation because it's 30 minutes. I thought it's 30 minutes, it's only 20 minutes. You talked about the cordon sanitaire, and that's quite true, because not the Memel question, but the Vilnius question was the key point for Germany and the Soviet Union to stop any attempts to go into the Baltic with the cordon sanitaire. And that's, I think it's very important because all the Western policy tried to widen this cordon sanitaire, and the Germans and especially the Soviets played it very cool here at Vilnius, always pointing out, we, the Soviets, we, the Germans, are the only states in the world to help poor Lithuania to get access to Vilnius. And if you are looking to this notorious Hitler-Stalin pact, the secret protocol, there it is. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union agree that Vilnius region will go to Lithuania. So thank you once more for the cordon sanitaire question.
Thank you for that, and that actually makes me think there should probably be a seventh question as well, which is what kind of, what was the level of cooperation between the German Reich and the Soviet Union on these issues, which we know obviously because of Rapallo and the wider framing, and then the Schwarze Reichswehr, that these cooperations were quite intense. And as you say, there's also specific interests in collaborating over Memel. But I think there's also, and I'm sure we'll hear about this from our Lithuanian colleagues, I think on the Lithuanian side, there's also an element of perhaps preferring the Soviet Union, however briefly, because they're going to leave again, whereas the Poles and the Germans are more likely to stick around. So thank you for those comments.
Any more comments, questions? Klaus, please.
Thank you. I have a question concerning the views of the British on Eastern Europe and the Baltic, specifically in the interwar period. My impression is, from what I know and also from what you presented with the big map of the British Empire post 1918, that Eastern Europe was a bit of a nuisance there. This notion of the wars of the pygmies and lots of nations that we don't know and that we don't care about. But there was also from some genuine interest, like Seton Watson, but also Keynes had some understanding that there is a genuine problem there that the British should concern themselves with. And I was wondering, what is your view? How much genuine interest in solving problems in Eastern Europe and the Baltics was there in Britain, and how much was it just something that they were hoping, as you said, that the League of Nations would take care of, and Britain just has to do its part in some sense?
Well, I should be careful what I say here, because Donatas Kupčiūnas, who's the Baltic Geopolitics Research Fellow at Cambridge, will be speaking, I think, on this in greater detail. But, I mean, the big picture, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's sort of tension between the fact that there are many individual experts who are pretty knowledgeable, although in the case of Seton Watson, also pretty opinionated. And, there are also controversial figures, and, they're in London and they're having their ears bent by Masaryk and others, with respect to the Central European settlement. And then you've got the geostrategic view, which is, as you say, is the idea that, you know, we're finished, we're done here, but they, you know, and they want to refocus on other issues. But the problem is the British keep on being dragged back into the region. So they, you know, they want to contain the Soviet Union. They then have a big headache, as you know, about what to do about the leftover Germans, you know, the Iron Division, all this sort of thing. Is one going to collaborate with them? And so it's a very messy policy which shifts over time. So ultimately, they spend an awful lot more time in and on the region than they'd expected in 1918. And indeed, there are casualties. I mean, one of the things that I'm often struck by is when you go to war memorials in Britain, you'll often see 1919. And people will say, oh, that's an error or something. But of course, that represents people killed in the wars, the intervention against the Soviet Union, but also the odd sailor and people like that killed in the Baltic Sea region. And there's one of the, I mean, perhaps the expert on this is Andrew Lambert in Britain, and he's actually writing a book about Britain's naval and strategic engagement in the region, and specifically he's also been working on this period between 1918 and 1923, and he teases out some of the issues you've raised. But as I say, Donatas, I think, will be elaborating on this at greater length.
Okay, then we'll wait for Donatas. Thank you, Brandon, for your contribution. And we have now time for the coffee break, which will be here. We're going to another place. Thank you.